Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 24, Section 4 Modern Ideas and Uncertainty. So, we're going to get started with talking about some of our uncertainty and some of our scientists who were kind of shaking up the world a little bit with some of their ideas. So the ideas of the time, space, and matter in terms of the universe were objective realities during this kind of leading up to this period of time. Matter was thought to be of solid material bodies called atoms. And one of these individuals who did a lot of research on this was a woman named Marie Curie. And she gained a lot of fame for her research that she did in France, but from her childhood, she was actually born in Poland, uh, wasn't able to go to a university in Poland, so she went to Paris and met her husband, and for the most part, had an opportunity to be educated. But in the 19th century, she discovered the element of radium and determined that it also gave off energy known as radiation. And if you look at the photo on the kind of right hand side of the screen, the watch faces and the clock faces that kind of have that green glowing appearance. That was because there were people that actually would painstakingly take paint that had radium mixed into it and paint the faces of these clocks so it had a glowing appearance. Um, which is kind of a dangerous thing, not knowing at that time that this radium was giving off all this radiation. There is this group of women known as the Radium Girls who were, basically industrial workers during this era of time who were painting these faces of the clocks, and they were taking like their paintbrushes and putting them into their mouth to get the tip of the brush a little bit thinner, uh, unbeknownst to them, exposing themselves to a lot of radiation. And a lot of these women had cancers of the mouth and the jaw, and eventually succumbed to this radium that they were exposed to. Number three, in the early 20th century, Albert Einstein, a German born scientist, came up with the theory of relativity. It stated that space and time are not absolutes, but relative to the observer. Neither space nor time has an existence independent of the human experience, and matter and energy reflect the relativity of time and space. Okay, deep thoughts with Albert Einstein. And you kind of get into this whole idea of MC square, which kind of goes back to old Einstein himself. Sigmund Freud, another thinker of this era of time. He was a physician from Vienna, Austria. He was Jewish, and that should take note because of the fact that towards the end of his life, this was about the same time as the rise of Hitler and his uh, kind of anti-Semitic activities that were happening. But Freud proposed some really weird theories for the time. Even though he was trained as a medical doctor, he had this really deep interest in what was happening in the human mind. And he proposed some theories regarding the nature of the human mind. Which basically get published into a book that is called The Interpretation of Dreams around 1900. His method that he kind of proposes in this is called psychoanalysis, which basically is this examination of the unconscious mind. He kind of used like an iceberg. To kind of explain it, that the tip of the iceberg is what we're kind of really aware of, and everything below the ice or the water level is our unconscious mind. And it kind of is divided into three different parts. You have the id, which are basically your instincts. It's kind of like the little devil that sits on your shoulder to tell you to do things when you probably shouldn't be doing them. You have your superego, which is like all of the morality that you have. It's kind of like the angel saying, don't do this. Sometimes the superego can be very critical of your behavior, and thus kind of monitors the and kind of balances out the id, and some of it's purely, I guess you could say, instinctual aspects of it. And then you have kind of what's in the middle, the ego, which is your reality. And uh, their ego has to balance the morality and the instincts. And this is all part of Freud's ideas. And he thought that sometimes even when we dreamt, that it was kind of like maybe a window into what was happening within our unconscious mind. And hence, he started coming up with these ideas of how to interpret dreams, to kind of help us understand what was in our unconscious mind. The big thing that you should take away from this is that, uh, even though he is a scientist, using like scientific methodology to prove anything with psychoanalysis, uh, is almost impossible. So you can't set up and experiment it, you can't replicate it, but it is an interesting theory nonetheless. Okay, the culture of modernity, art was also very important during this period of time. And in the late 1800s, artists were seeking new forms of expression. And this is kind of bringing about this whole idea of Impressionism, which began in France in the 1870s. And it had a lot to do with the fact that a lot of these artists who were, kind of stuck in indoor studios were wanting to move outward and to go out into the countryside, to paint nature directly, to use different light, to kind of help them, kind of convey their feelings and such. Claude Monet, who painted the two paintings kind of on the left hand side of the screen, was one of the first Impressionist artists. But as time goes on, we get into this era of post Impressionism. And granted, it's only like a 10-year span that we're going to see this, but it also arose in parts of France and kind of Western Europe. Vincent van Gogh, who was technically Dutch, um, was probably one of the better known post Impressionist artists. And the two paintings on the right hand side of the screen are kind of a tribute to him. Probably the most famous out of all of these paintings is Starry Night, that you see kind of on the far right. But he's also known for his images of flowers and such. But he believed that color was very important, and that in itself what we're painting and the use of colors and the brush strokes, really formed its own language. Okay, and he thought that artists should paint what they feel, which probably takes him away from the ultra realism that you would have seen during the time of the Renaissance. Extreme nationalism, which is kind of the darker side of all of this. But nationalism became more intense during the late 1800s, and it was also tied to this belief of social Darwinism. If you know anything about Charles Darwin, he came up with this idea of natural selection, did a lot of research on the Galapagos Islands studying different species of animals. But he basically got into this idea that, if a species wanted to evolve, they had to adapt to the environment. Well, some of these ideas were kind of taken and twisted a little bit. And one of these guys that kind of took Darwin's ideas and kind of spun them in a way that he thought would probably help himself was a fella named Herbert Spencer that you see pictured on the right hand side. Spencer was British, and he came up with this idea of social Darwinism, and he believed that social progress came from the survival of the fittest. Only the strong will survive and the weak shall decline. I mean, it sounds a little bit like Darwin, but in a way, it kind of fuels things like imperialism, it fuels nationalism, it fuels some really dark things like eugenics. All that is kind of coming out of this era of time. And it was very popular in Europe, definitely popular here in the United States, and maybe gives some of our political leaders reasons to do things like go to war. So, extreme nationalism used this theory, saying that the nations were in a struggle for existence in which the fittest nations would survive. And sometimes this theory is used to justify things like racism or the belief that some peoples are superior to others, either through their culture or religion or politics or whatnot. So, this extreme nationalism led to a really awful event. Um, Anti Semitism isn't really anything that was new in Europe at this period of time, but um, there was an event that really kind of like brought it to the forefront. And if you're not familiar, anti-Semitism is kind of this idea of discrimination towards Jewish people. A fellow named Alfred Dreyfus, who had been a officer in the French military in the roughly 1870s, was accused of being a spy for Germany. And you got to understand kind of what was happening between France and Germany. There was several wars that were happening between both, and the border between France and Germany kind of moved every so many years. Um, but at Dreyfus's trial, uh, neither him nor his attorney were allowed to see any of the evidence against him. Some of that is because of how France sets up their judicial system. It's a little different than what we're probably familiar with here in the United States. You're kind of like guilty until you're proven innocent. Whereas in the United States, you're innocent until you're proven guilty. And thus, it's really easy, to maybe falsely accuse someone. For his punishment, after he was convicted, he was sent to Devil's Island, which is off the coast of French Guiana, which is in South America. There's a little photo of Devil's Island, and you can kind of see where it's located in conjunction to French Guiana. But um, he was sent there because it was just basically a place that no one would really be able to escape from. And what's interesting is, as time would go by, evidence pointed to another officer as the person who was really the spy. Dreyfus was not given a new trial. Really, his image and name were tarnished. And what ends up happening is you're going to have more rioting and more anti Semitism that's going to become more commonplace in parts of Europe as we're kind of moving into the 20th century. Russian pogroms, which are another form of anti-Semitism. It's a organized massacre of Jews. Was happening in parts of Russia and maybe what would be today part of the Ukraine. It led to hundreds of thousands of Jews trying to immigrate to escape persecution. Some of them went to places within Europe, like Germany, Poland, some of them England. But there were a number of immigrants that actually made it to the United States. But there were a handful that decided to immigrate to Palestine, which was part of the Ottoman Empire, kind of at the 1900, kind of the turn of the century, which became home for a Jewish nationalist movement called Zionism. Zionism is this idea that the Jewish people want to reestablish their historical homeland. And one of the fellows that was very involved in trying to, kind of convince the world that this was a thing to do was a man named Theodore Herzl, who you see pictured right below here. He was British, and he started talking a lot about political Zionism. Matter of fact, he even wrote a book called The Jewish State in 1896, where he basically talked about why the Jews needed a homeland. The Ottoman Empire at this period of time was opposing this, but Jewish immigration to Palestine, I mean, on a yearly average, there were about 3,000 Jews who annually went to Palestine between 1904 and 1914, kind of on the verge of the First World War. All right. Thank you very much.